The Meridian Trade Nexus had hosted exactly 347 interspecies negotiations without a single incident involving rolled-up sleeves. That streak was about to end in spectacular fashion, though nobody in Conference Room Zeta 7 quite realized it yet. Dr. Reina Cortez sat with the patient expression of someone who'd explained basic concepts to particularly dim undergraduates far too many times. Across the polished Xenolithic table, Ambassador Keth Var of the Hegemony Coalition was doing that thing powerful beings do when they mistake volume for authority, speaking louder and gesturing more dramatically, as if the laws of physics would bend to his theatrical performance. Your species arrives here with grand proclamations about territorial disputes and resource allocation. Keth Var's translator rendered his chittering into something resembling diplomatic discourse. But what could you possibly understand about the complexities of interstellar conflict management? The Vorthan delegates' crystalline form pulsed in what their species considered polite agreement. The humans have been space-capable for what, 2 centuries? We've been managing galactic stability for over 4,000 years. Precisely. Keth Var's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. They speak of securing shipping lanes and deterring aggression as if these concepts weren't refined by civilizations far older and wiser. Dr. Cortez nodded thoughtfully, her fingers drumming against the table's surface in a rhythm that seemed almost musical. The Silurian representative, a being that resembled nothing so much as an evolved cephalopod with delusions of grandeur, leaned forward with what might have been curiosity. You remain remarkably calm, human, considering the dismissive nature of these observations. The Silurian's voice carried through bioacoustic modulators. Do you not feel compelled to defend your species' capabilities? Oh, I'm considering it, Cortez replied, her tone carrying the same casual warmth one might use to discuss weekend plans. Though I suspect we might have different definitions of several key terms. Keth Var's laugh was the sound of grinding metal attempting humor. Different definitions? Child, warfare is warfare. Territory is territory. Power projection follows universal principles that your species couldn't possibly grasp in such a brief evolutionary moment. Evolutionary moment. Cortez repeated the phrase as if tasting something mildly interesting. That's a fascinating perspective. It's reality, Keth Var snapped. The hegemony has maintained peace through strength for millennia. We've fought wars that reshaped entire star systems. We understand the true cost of conflict in ways your species simply cannot comprehend. The room's environmental systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect atmospheric balance for all 6 represented species. Dr. Cortez glanced briefly at her wrist display, not checking the time, but something else entirely. Whatever she saw there made her expression shift almost imperceptibly. Wars that reshaped star systems, she mused. How many casualties would you say constitutes a major conflict in your experience? The Vorthan delegate's crystalline structure chimed softly. The Third Hegemony War claimed nearly 2 million lives across 4 worlds. It remains the bloodiest conflict in recorded galactic history. 2 million. Cortez's voice held no mockery, no judgment, just the tone of someone filing away an interesting data point. Across 4 worlds, over what time span? 17 years of active hostilities, Keth Var replied proudly. The logistical complexity alone required unprecedented coordination. Your species lacks the institutional knowledge for such undertakings. Institutional knowledge, another phrase she seemed to be cataloging. And you believe this experience gives you authority to dismiss human understanding of conflict management. The Silurian delegates' tentacles writhed in what their species considered deep thought. Ambassador Keth Var's point, while perhaps inelegantly expressed, reflects legitimate concerns about human military doctrine. Your species' conflicts appear limited to single-world engagements with primitive technology. Single-world engagements? Cortez nodded. Yes, that's accurate. Kethvar seized on this apparent concession. Exactly. How could beings constrained to planetary warfare possibly comprehend the strategic depths required for interstellar conflict? And that's when Dr. Reina Cortez did something that would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for generations to come. She smiled. Not the diplomatic expression she'd worn throughout the negotiations, but something altogether more unsettling. Then, with movements so deliberate they bordered on ritualistic, she began removing her jacket. I suppose, she said, folding the garment with precise care. That depends entirely on how you define warfare. The jacket came off to reveal arms that told stories. What had been concealed beneath diplomatic attire was now visible to every sensor, every optical array, every curious gaze in the room. And what they saw defied immediate comprehension. Her skin was a canvas of intricate markings that definitely weren't decorative. Numbers cascaded down her left forearm in neat columns, coordinates, perhaps, or statistical analyses. Geometric patterns wrapped around her right arm with the precision of technical specifications. And threading through it all, in script so small it required enhanced magnification to read, were names. Thousands upon thousands of names. Dr. Cortez began rolling up her sleeves with the same methodical precision she'd used to remove her jacket. As more skin became visible, the pattern became clear. This wasn't art. This was documentation. The room fell silent. Not the polite pause of diplomatic consideration, but the profound quiet that occurs when every being present realizes they've made a category error so fundamental that all previous assumptions require immediate revision. Kethvar's translator system struggled with the sudden absence of anything to translate. The Vorthon delegate was the first to break protocol. Their crystalline form shifted frequencies, scanning the markings with increasing intensity until their normally pristine harmonic emissions became discordant with something approaching panic. Those coordinates, the Vorthon whispered, their voice fracturing across multiple tonal ranges. Hadrian IV Pieter's stand. The Baglan corridor. The Silurian's tentacles retracted so quickly they made an audible snap. You recognize military designations. Not military designations. The Vorthon's entire structure was now pulsing in rapid, agitated bursts. Memorial coordinates. Those are grave sites. Dr. Cortez adjusted her sleeves, with the same care someone might use when arranging flowers. Very good. Your species maintains excellent stellar cartography records. The Keth observer, who until this moment had remained as motionless as furniture, suddenly erupted into rapid clicking sounds that their vocal synthesizer couldn't quite manage. When the device finally caught up, the translation was stark. How many graves? That's an interesting question, Cortez replied conversationally. How are we counting? Individual markers? Mass sites? Or are you asking about the statistical projections embedded in the dermal matrices? Ambassador Kethvar's mandibles had locked in a position that suggested either deep thought or complete system failure. Statistical projections? The predictive algorithms, population dynamics, resource allocation, demographic modeling. Cortez gestured toward a section of her left arm where numbers formed intricate spirals. Standard post-conflict analysis. Surely your species performs similar calculations. The Silurian delegate's bioacoustic modulators produced a sound like wind through a graveyard. Post-conflict analysis for what scale of engagement? Well, that depends on your classification system, Cortez said. What we call the Century of Sorrows involved roughly 200 million direct casualties. though the demographic modeling suggests the actual impact affected closer to 500 million individuals when you factor in economic displacement and social disruption. The temperature in conference room. Zeta 7 hadn't changed, but every non-human present felt suddenly cold. 200 million, the Vorthon repeated, their harmonic patterns shifting into frequencies that would have been inaudible to human ears. Across how many star systems? Oh no, that was entirely terrestrial. Single-world engagement, as you correctly noted earlier. Cortez's tone remained perfectly pleasant. Though I suppose the orbital bombardment components could technically qualify as trans-atmospheric operations. The Keth observer's clicking reached machine gun intensity. Orbital bombardment of your own. Planet? Several orbital bombardments, actually. Strategic necessity demanded flexibility in approach. Cortez paused, seeming to consider her phrasing. Though I should clarify, when I say century of sorrows, I'm referring to the period humans classify as roughly 1850 to 1950 in our standard calendar. Some historians prefer different periodization schemes. Kethvar's translator system made a sound like digital indigestion. You're describing a single century, not multiple millennia of accumulated conflict? A single century, yes, though it was admittedly an eventful one. Cortez traced a finger along a particularly dense cluster of markings. These sections document what we call the World Wars. Bit of a misnomer, really. Only involved about 70% of our global population directly. The Silurian delegates' tentacles were now wrapped so tightly around their central mass, they resembled a knot. Global population participation in warfare? What was your total planetary population during this period? Oh, somewhere between 1 and 2 billion individuals, depending on which decade you're examining. The silence that followed this statement wasn't diplomatic. It was the kind of quiet that precedes either revelation or complete psychological breakdown. The Vorthon was the first to attempt processing this information. You're claiming that a single world species with a population under 2 billion sustained casualties of 200 million in a single century through internal warfare. Well, that's just the century of sorrows, Cortez clarified helpfully. The markings cover a broader historical period. These sections here document earlier conflicts, what we call the classical period, the medieval campaigns, the colonial expansions, standard historical categorization. Classical period, Kethvar echoed weakly. Roughly 3,000 years of documented warfare, though record-keeping becomes less reliable the further back you go. Cortez rolled her sleeve up another inch, revealing additional layers of documentation. These numerical sequences represent what your species might find interesting. Logistical data for the Mongol campaigns. Casualty projections for the 30 Years' War. Resource allocation models for the Napoleonic era. The Keth observers' clicking had stopped entirely. In their species, complete silence indicated either death or the contemplation of concepts too vast for normal cognitive processing. When you say 3,000 years, the Silurian managed, you mean accumulated across multiple civilizations, correct? Different species, different evolutionary periods? Same species, same planet, continuous historical development. Cortez's voice held the same tone someone might use to explain that water is wet. Though I suppose you could argue for distinct civilizational phases, if you prefer that analytical framework. What happened next would later be referenced in diplomatic training manuals as the meridian, incident, or more colloquially among intelligence services, the day everyone started fact-checking the humans. The hegemony's senior intelligence operative, who had been monitoring the negotiations from a secure observation deck, was frantically accessing archived data through neural interfaces that weren't designed for panic-driven searches. Ambassador Keth Var, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of diplomatic composure. "Emergency data requisition," he barked to his aide. "Cross-reference human historical records with our xenological surveys. I want population dynamics, technological assessments, and conflict analysis. Now." The Silurian delegates' bioacoustic systems were producing sounds that resembled a funeral dirge, composed by someone having a nervous breakdown. The mathematical implications alone, if their statements are accurate. "They are," interrupted the Vorthan, whose crystalline structure was now cycling through colors that had no names in most languages. "I've been running verification algorithms against our deep space archaeological surveys. The radiological signatures match, the geological scarring patterns align, the atmospheric composition anomalies in their historical samples." The Keth observer finally resumed clicking, but in a pattern so rapid and complex, their translator unit simply gave up and displayed error messages. Dr. Cortez watched this technological meltdown with the mild interest of someone observing an unusual weather pattern. "Is there a specific aspect of the data you'd like me to clarify?" "You mentioned logistical models," the Silurian gasped, "for something called the Napoleonic era. What operational parameters are we discussing?" "Continental scale mobilization. Roughly 5 million personnel under arms across multiple theaters. Standard combined arms doctrine, artillery, cavalry, infantry coordination. Naval blockades, siege warfare, scorched earth tactics." Cortez paused, apparently searching for the appropriate technical vocabulary. "Think of it as comprehensive resource denial across approximately 10,000 kilometers of active frontage." The hegemony aide's data tablet made a sound like electronic sobbing as it processed search results. "Sir," the aide whispered to Kethvar, "the Human Historical Archives. The numbers aren't exaggerated. If anything, they appear to be conservative estimates." "Conservative?" Kethvar's translation came out as a strangled electronic shriek. "The Somme campaign," the aide read from rapidly scrolling data. "Single engagement, duration, 4 months. Casualties, 1,300,000. Tactical result, inconclusive. Strategic impact, minimal." The Vorthan's harmonic emissions had now shifted into frequencies that would have been physically painful to most carbon-based life forms. 4 months, 1 location, over 1 million casualties for minimal strategic impact. "The Somme was more of a tactical learning experience," Cortez explained with the patient tone of a professor discussing a particularly interesting case study. Battle doctrine was evolving rapidly during that period. Machine gun integration, artillery coordination, chemical weapons deployment. It was a period of significant military innovation. "Chemical weapons?" the Silurian repeated faintly. "Standard defensive enhancement technology. Though I should mention that the Geneva Conventions later restricted certain applications. Humans do try to maintain some operational boundaries, even during intensive conflicts." The Keth observer's translator unit suddenly burst back to life with what sounded like digital screaming. "Boundary conditions? What constitutes intensive conflict by human standards?" "Well, that's somewhat subjective," Cortez admitted. "Some historians classify the Second World War as the definitive intensive conflict, 60 to 80 million casualties over 6 years, depending on how you calculate civilian involvement. Global theater operations, strategic bombing campaigns, mechanized warfare, nuclear weapons deployment. The room's environmental systems detected hazardous stress pheromones from multiple species and automatically began increasing oxygen levels while reducing ambient temperature." "Nuclear weapons," Kethvar whispered. "You developed nuclear weapons during an active conflict?" "Developed, tested, and deployed. Twice. Though I should emphasize that was considered an exceptional circumstance. Most human conflicts are resolved through conventional means." The hegemony aide was now making sounds that the translator unit identified as either laughter or complete psychological collapse. "Sir, according to their military archives, They classify nuclear weapons as tactical options rather than strategic deterrents. Tactical options, the Vorthan echoed. For certain operational scenarios, yes, though post-war analysis suggested that conventional bombing campaigns were actually more effective for most strategic objectives. Nuclear deployment tends to create long-term environmental complications that interfere with territorial occupation goals. The Silurian delegates' tentacles were now arranged in patterns that their species associated with imminent death. You're describing optimization strategies for planetary devastation. Risk-benefit analysis for large-scale operations, Cortez corrected gently. Standard military planning requires consideration of all available assets. Ambassador Kethvar's aide was now reading directly from their data feeds in a voice that suggested complete dissociation from reality. Korean engagement, 3 million casualties. Vietnam operations, 4 million casualties. Gulf campaigns, minimal casualties due to technological asymmetry. Afghanistan theater, 2 decades of continuous operations. Iraq sectors, sequential engagement cycles. Those are more recent conflicts, Cortez acknowledged. 20th and 21st century operations. The military doctrine had become considerably more sophisticated by that point. More sophisticated, the Keth Observer's translator managed, before making a sound like electronic death rattles. Precision engagement systems, satellite coordination, drone warfare, network-centric battle management. The learning curve from earlier periods was quite instructive. The Vorthan had now shifted to frequencies so high they were approaching the ultrasonic range. Learning curve? Iterative improvement in casualty optimization and resource efficiency. Modern human military doctrine can achieve strategic objectives with significantly reduced personnel losses compared to historical periods. And that, according to the diplomatic observers who later analyzed the recordings, was the exact moment when every non-human intelligence service in the galaxy simultaneously realized they had been categorically wrong about everything. 6 hours later, Conference Room Zeta 7 had been transformed into something resembling a crisis management center. Additional delegates had arrived from 3 different star systems. Intelligence analysts were huddled around data terminals like priests at digital altars, and the Meridian Trade Nexus's medical bay had treated 17 cases of acute existential anxiety disorder. Dr. Cortez sat in the same chair she'd occupied at the beginning of the negotiations, jacket properly buttoned, sleeves covering their revelatory contents. She appeared to be reading something on her personal device, with the relaxed attention of someone reviewing dinner menus. Ambassador Kethvar approached with the careful movements of someone navigating around unexploded ordnance. Dr. Cortez, I believe we may have misunderstood certain fundamental aspects of human civilization. Misunderstandings happen, Cortez replied, without looking up from her device. Though I'm curious about your revised assessments. The hegemony's senior military advisor, a being whose exoskeleton was designed to convey unshakable authority, spoke with the voice of someone whose worldview had been fed through a meat grinder. Our strategic planning models require complete reconstruction. What we considered maximum theoretical casualty tolerance, your species treats as acceptable operational parameters. Acceptable might be overstating it, Cortez said thoughtfully. Humans generally prefer peaceful solutions. It's just that our definition of peaceful might be calibrated differently than yours. The Vorthan delegate, who had spent the last several hours consulting with their home system's finest philosophers, emitted a sound like crystal wind chimes in a hurricane. Your species considers nuclear warfare a tactical consideration. How do you define genocide? Legally or operationally? The question hung in the recycled air like a particularly ominous prediction. Perhaps, suggested the Silurian delegate, whose tentacles were now arranged in patterns indicating extreme diplomatic distress. We should discuss the original trade negotiations, resource allocation, shipping lane security, territorial boundaries. Excellent idea, Cortez agreed, enthusiastically. Though I suspect our mutual understanding of terms like security and territorial integrity might benefit from some definitional alignment. Kethvar's aide whispered urgently in his ear. Whatever information was conveyed made the ambassador's mandibles arrange themselves in configurations that suggested either enlightenment or total system failure. Dr. Cortez, Kethvar began carefully, when humanity references peacekeeping operations in your proposal documents. Standard terminology for maintaining regional stability through measured force projection. And when you specify measured force projection, whatever level of engagement proves necessary to achieve operational objectives while minimizing collateral complications. The Keth observer, who had remained silent since their translator unit's earlier breakdown, suddenly produced a rapid-fire burst of clicks that the repaired device rendered as, "What does humanity consider disproportionate response?" Cortez paused, apparently giving the question serious consideration. That's actually a fascinating philosophical question. Human military doctrine generally holds that any response is proportionate if it successfully prevents the need for larger-scale interventions later. It's essentially utilitarian mathematics applied to conflict resolution. The assembled delegates exchanged glances that would have been meaningful if any of them had possessed the cultural context to interpret each other's expressions of mounting horror. Perhaps, the Vorthon suggested with harmonic frequencies that indicated approaching nervous collapse, we should establish some baseline parameters for this discussion. What does humanity consider a minor border dispute? Anything resolvable through diplomatic pressure backed by credible deterrent capability. And credible deterrent capability consists of whatever force structure the opposing party finds convincing. The Silurian delegates' bioacoustic systems produced a sound like whale songs, mixed with funeral dirges. What if they're not convinced by conventional deterrents? Then you escalate until they are. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet held a different quality. Not the stunned recognition of earlier, but the profound stillness that occurs when intelligent beings realize they're sitting across a negotiating table from something they don't understand and can't predict. Kethvar cleared his throat with a sound like grinding metal attempting dignity. Dr. Cortez, I believe I owe you an apology. When I asked what humanity could possibly know about warfare, you were operating on perfectly reasonable assumptions based on available data, Cortez replied graciously. How could you have known that humans consider warfare a routine governmental function rather than a civilization-threatening catastrophe? Routine governmental function, the Keth observer repeated, like taxation or infrastructure maintenance. Necessary, occasionally unpleasant, but fundamentally just another tool for social organization. And there, in that moment of crystalline clarity, the assembled delegates finally understood what they were really negotiating with. Not a species that was inexperienced with conflict, but one so thoroughly experienced that they'd systematized the entire process into bureaucratic routine. The irony was not lost on any of them, least of all Dr. Cortez, who had spent the entire day patiently explaining that humans were, by their own standards, fundamentally peaceful people who simply had a different perspective on what constituted reasonable problem-solving techniques. Outside the conference room windows, the Meridian Trade Nexus continued its slow rotation through space, carrying within its hull the quietly revolutionary realization that the galaxy's newest members had just redefined everyone's understanding of normal.